Thank you very much. Good morning. It's a true honor to be here. The official title of my speech, as you heard, is Taking Injustice Personally. There is also an unofficial one, the importance of giving a shit. I apologize for the language, but basically that's where it all begins. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us stand up for people who we've never met, but who need our support. That's what the rogue governments and other human rights abusers fear most, people who care. And that's, after all, what integrity is, at least to me. Many years ago, I was documenting a spree of enforced disappearances during the civil war in Nepal. And one day, after hours and hours of driving and walking, we come to yet another tiny village. I walk into a small hut and start talking to an elderly woman, start the interview as usual, introducing myself, explaining what I do, and asking her the simple, open-ended question. Tell me what happened to you. And she looked at me, almost in disbelief, and asked, have you really come all this way to ask me this question? And after processing what she said, because it suddenly defined the essence of human rights work to me, I explained that not only was I there to document her story, but that I would make sure the world knows about it, and that I would do my best to make sure that she and others in the village have their sons and other relatives back, or at least find out what happened to them. I was lucky. I grew up in the most fascinating place, in the most fascinating time. During my middle and high school years, a totalitarian system which in Russia seemed as impervious as it now seems in many other places, was crumbling and crushing in front of our eyes. And while it is heartbreaking to see where Russia is heading now, I will never forget what the wind of change felt like. Nobody would ever be able to convince me that fighting oppression and injustice is hopeless or impractical, and that some regimes are never going to change, because I've seen them change in front of my eyes. That quickly defined my professional choice, first as a journalist and then as a lawyer and human rights defender. But I still remember the first time I was able to make a difference in the life of a total stranger. I actually have never told this story before, so that's an exclusive. I was 19, I was working on a radio station, and one day a friend of mine, a very experienced journalist who was working in many war zones herself at that time, but was sick, so couldn't really, wasn't particularly functional at that stage, she called me up and said that she needed my help. In short, she's been covering the civil war in Tajikistan, one of these former Soviet republics that became a country. And she wanted me to help evacuate a family from there. They were 8 people, including a young woman who was very pregnant. They were stuck in a tiny mountain village, and the village was basically about to be attacked. Their life was clearly in danger. My friend wanted me, just listen to this, to get a military airplane. That was the only way to get there, and fly the mother of the family, who was in Moscow, where I was, to pick up her children and husband and bring them back. It was Friday, and the plane had to leave on Monday if we had any chance of rescuing them. Like most of us in this situation, and I look at the audience and I think many of you are around 19, maybe a little bit younger, a little bit older. So I said, obviously, you're out of your mind. Where on earth am I going to find a plane? And she said, why don't you try first and then say no to me? So 40 phone calls later, I got through to a military airport outside of Moscow, and I got immediately put through to a medical ward, because undoubtedly they thought I was completely crazy. And then that's where a miracle happened, because the person who picked up the phone also, for some strange reason, seemed to care. So he listened to me, to my incoherent explanations, and instead of telling me to get lost, he sprung to action. More phone calls and letters now to the military headquarters followed, and on Monday the mother got on the plane. In war-torn Tajikistan, they escorted her to the village, they picked up the family, they brought them back a few days later. I spoke to them once when they got to Moscow, and we have never been in touch again. The baby who was born shortly after they got evacuated is probably in university now. The evacuation probably saved their lives, but it also had a profound effect on me. In fact, I feel I owe this Tajik family more than I can imagine. In many ways, they are the reason I am standing here today, and the reason I have been able to deal with some of the largest occupational hazards we have in this work, a sometimes inevitable despair. Because I know that if you care, there is a good chance you'll find someone else who does. And that starts a chain reaction that eventually leads to change. I have since worked in many war zones and closed countries where unimaginable abuses happen. I spoke to mothers in Chechnya who spend their days going from one mass grave to another, looking through bodies, hoping to find their children. I saw villages burned to the ground and elderly men and women with charred faces and burned hands trying to rescue some small remaining possessions that they had. I sneaked into war-torn northern Sri Lanka to interview Tamils who were fleeing the so-called no-fire zones, where in fact they were killed in thousands. I documented a massacre in Uzbekistan, which the government was hoping nobody would ever find out about. I was in hospitals in Aleppo when they were bombed. I recently work in eastern Ukraine, looking at the post-conflict dirty war, where dozens of people disappeared in secret detention on both sides. And most recently, I was in Nauru, where refugees held by Australia in an open-air prison are subjected to extreme suffering and abuse. There is one distinctive characteristic that is common for all these places. Abuses happen in darkness. The governments and most other perpetrators commit horrendous abuses against their own or other people because they believe that they can hide them and that nobody would care enough to expose them. They rely on their victims being voiceless and invisible. And that's where we come in. As the governments are becoming more and more sophisticated at hiding the violations and fabricating evidence, we actually have also made some very incredible advances in our methods of documentation. I still have a pen and a notebook and a camera in my travel bag, and I still interview hundreds of witnesses. But these traditional methods are now supported by a whole range of other things, such as military experts who are able to identify which weapons are being used and where they come from, by forensic experts, by remote sensing, by social media listening, by satellite imagery. In other words, there is almost no place in the world where the perpetrators can assume that they're immune from our scrutiny, even if they deny us access. But exposure alone doesn't achieve much in and of itself. Amnesty International, where I currently lead our research worldwide, is based on a simple and incredibly powerful idea. Taking injustice personally means that there are no strangers in the world, that we can make people care about others whom they never met or even heard about. What's more, it's the notion that everyone, without exception, can contribute to fighting injustice. And this shared understanding empowers not only the ones we fight for, but each one of us. We at Amnesty created a way to make these individual actions and commitment form a movement that is known all over the world as a symbol of hope for thousands of people who would otherwise have no hope whatsoever. It always gives me goosebumps to talk about some of our wins, of some of the things that we were able to do. There are numerous examples. I just give you a couple to give you a sense. There was a young man in Nigeria named Moses, and he got arrested for stealing a few cell phones. And then he got tortured and sentenced to death. And he spent 8 years on death row. And all these 8 years, Thousands of Amnesty members and supporters around the world wrote letters and petitions and emails and faxes for his release. And just think about it for a second. It worked. He actually got pardoned. After all these years, he walked out of prison, he went to his home village and hugged his mother, who probably wasn't hoping to see him alive. Just a few months ago in El Salvador, a woman named Maria Teresa, who was jailed and sentenced for 40 years for a miscarriage, was released because after we found out about it, about her and others who were subjected to such incredible injustice, our members simply wouldn't give up. In our day and time, human rights work is not about writing reports. It is about walking into a police station and demanding, let them go or I will send you to The Hague. I probably cannot send him to The Hague, but he doesn't know it. It is about seeing the military tearing down refugee tents and pushing people into harm's way and not putting down your satellite phone until you reach someone who can stop it. It is about flooding officials' faxes, mailboxes and emails with petitions until they realize that they have to give up because we clearly won't. It is also about collecting evidence, sometimes for months and years, because even those perpetrators who feel that they're immune now, who feel that they can get away with murder, will end up behind bars. And that's when our solid evidence will contribute to bringing them to account. When I speak to various audiences, people often ask me what they can do. Often I say exactly what I started with here. Just begin with giving a shit. But since you're all here this morning, I think you already do. So keep it up. Do not let the apathy, the indifference, the government propaganda, or even the voice of reason to take you away from what you know is right. I've been doing this work for many years, and I can absolutely assure you that if you always listen to the voice of reason, you're not going to get very far. One of the key lessons I bring back from my trips is that in the face of unimaginable suffering, death, destruction, and abuse, ordinary men, women, and children, people like us, don't give up. And to honor their courage, their resilience, their hope, we also have to keep going. So, in other words, care and dare, and you'd be surprised how much you can achieve. Thank you very much.